Dave, thanks for taking the time to speak with us. I think everybody knows your reputation as someone who sets trends globally in food. That's how you and I met when you luckily enjoyed the first Impossible burger I ever made for a chef like you. But this group probably has more in common with where you grew up, why your parents came here. So maybe we could start a little bit with going all the way back to when you were growing up as a Korean American. What was that like? What was your dad like? What was your mom like? I think I'd love to hear about that.
Well, my dad immigrated to New York City in 1963, and I think he wound up in Northern Virginia in the mid 70s, maybe early 70s. And he moved to that area because of work, and he wound up working his way up to manager to an owner of a couple restaurants. We grew up in Northern Virginia. And when now it's like a sprawling suburban thing. And when we were there was nothing. It was literally still farmland. As we sort of moved around and got into neighborhoods where there were more people, I realized that my family was different than everyone else's family. And not just the skin color. It was how we ate, how things smelled, the things we celebrated. Everything was different. My dad was probably the least religious of his siblings. He's the youngest of like 9, and 8 of them moved to the States. Very religious household, as I think a lot of Korean Americans can realize. I think my dad's mother was one of the earliest Christian converts in what is now North Korea. And, it was a tale of two worlds, really. It was trying to fit into white American suburbia and then trying to learn Korean language on Saturdays and go to Sunday school and like what seemed like 5 hours of church service on Sundays. And it was just trying to fit in, never fitting in on the Korean side, never fitting in sort of the non-Korean side. And my parents, to be honest, growing up, I don't really remember seeing them. I have almost zero memories of my father because he was always at work. And I lived mostly growing up because I was the youngest, and there's a big age gap between me and my second closest sibling, with my grandparents, my mom's parents. My grandfather on my mom's side, he came from a very well-to-do family, and long story cut short, through embezzlement and everything else, they lost everything. And my mom grew up very wealthy, and there's photos of a castle and dogs and deer and everything. And my dad had nothing, but my grandfather basically was Japanese. He did not like Korean food. He would have to resort to cooking Japanese food oftentimes himself, or we'd go to eat sushi. So in some ways, I grew up loving Japanese food and culture without even understanding it. And he didn't eat kimchi, for example. He thought it was disgusting.
Wow.
Yeah. So he was very, very Japanese, but obviously very prideful to be Korean as well, because he served in the Korean government, but what he liked culturally. And so I didn't really connect the dots till later in life, what that would mean for me. And when I did see my dad, it was usually getting yelled at or Korean punishment. And again, I think that's very different. If you're under the age of, say, 40, and now maybe 35 would be the latest, it's not a competition, but how our parents raised us is very, very different than, say, anyone born after or came to this country after like 1988 or 1990.
Yeah, absolutely true. I mean, listen, you've had a son, you have Hugo. How do you think about those differences now that you are father compared to the childhood you grew up in? I mean, how do you reconcile the way a lot of us were raised versus what we try to be as parents?
Well, I think the answer is you're going to constantly wrestle with it. I don't think there is sort of a bifurcated response. I think it is, I can hate my parents and love them simultaneously. There are a lot of things that my dad did. Like in the book, for example, I just chose one story, and that's a story where I broke my leg and I was not allowed to go to the hospital for 6 days. If that happened today, my dad's in jail.
Yeah.
I could never even contemplate that with my son. But, when you talk to other people, that's just like, well, that was just normal. And then when I think about it, as much as I want to give them the agency to have parented differently, how would they have known? I also grew up for a couple years with my dad's mom, and she was mean. I have no recollection other than she was just mean, like really crazy mean. Always in a humbuck, always with her hair pulled back, always hitting us, always yelling at us, always, again, and this is what I had to really dwell upon, because my mom's mom, amazing cook, showered us with love. We loved her. We loved her so much. And, it was, again, we divided it like good hominy and bad hominy, and my mom's mom doted on us and was emotive with her love. My dad's mom, upon years of reflection, she was trying to teach us how to survive.
Tough love.
Yeah, and it wasn't even tough love. She was literally trying to teach us that everything will be taken away from you. Everything will be stolen from you. You cannot count on anybody, and everything you need to sort of scrounge and squirrel away. It's tough love, not to show us love per se, but to literally toughen us up.
Yeah.
And it's hard to love that, but it's true.
Do you think that helped you, Dave, as an entrepreneur, this idea of like scarcity thinking? Like,
yeah,
you have to fight for everything.
There's no question that mindset has taught us. Well, let me back this up. The best phrase from my mom was, this quarantine is, people aren't dying from bombs and bullets and mines. You have a roof over your head. You have hot food. She's like, this is not bad.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's a weird mindset to have.
Yeah. We're seeing a lot more as people who watch you from afar with your mom. Cooking with her. She's on Ugly Delicious Love, but she's just a part of your life, it seems anyway. Like, has your relationship with your mom always been that awesome? Has that evolved and changed at all?
Yeah, it's evolved. I think, my parents' relationship has evolved. I think my mom has mellowed out if you talk to any Korean American, they'll say, yeah, your parents mellowed out. For sure, I feel like that's unanimous. And my mom definitely mellowed out. My dad mellowed out in different ways. But, I was a spoiled rat. My mom just gave me whatever I needed. So that's why she calls me Wang Jining to this day. Until Hugo was born, now he's Wang Jining Jr. But I was doted on by her, and that was like, if I had to choose parents that I got along with better, certainly my mom, because she was good cop to my dad's bad cop. But we never cooked together. She's never given me a recipe, and she's still Korean.
What? So many probably listening to this. I'm, for example, the youngest son with two older sisters, and I probably was doted on way too much. Did that affect growing up, the way you and your siblings interacted? Was it always understood that you were the prince of the house, or that all broke down?
For sure it was, because I was so much younger. I'm like maybe 9-10 years younger than my sister. Just call a spade. I was an accident, right? So and they always say like their lives changed when I was born. Again, I don't put much into that kind of horoscope Korean ways. I think it was just randomness, but I certainly had a different age gap, and the way I grew up was very different than my siblings. Like very, very different. They paved the way in so many different areas for me. But going back to that question you asked, is that hardship or how I grew up, did it pay off in me being an entrepreneur? 100%. But I'd also argue it did not prepare me to learn how to be happy. And I think that's something that Korean culture to this day has a hard time letting go of the pain and suffering that either our relatives inherited or went through, or that we have sort of been burdened with to carry on. And that's the question that I often have is, I think I'd rather be less successful and happier than what the parents wanted, right?
Well, you've been really honest about how you struggled, right? With rage and depression and this kind of like trauma of being a product of parents from a different country. What helped you? Are there any bright moments for you that you kind of look back on to reconcile some of what you're talking about?
I don't have that many fond memories growing up. I mean, I was forced to play golf. I didn't have a childhood that a lot of my friends had, because from age 5 to say till I got to high school, like I don't think, maybe in 7 years, maybe there's 100, maybe less than 100 days I didn't play golf. Even in the dead of winter, I was hitting golf balls. So much of my childhood is like wrapped around me having to play golf, me being scared of my dad. So it's hard to have like happy memories when that's literally all you were doing. And I think that's something, again, a lot of Korean kids can relate to. It was golf for me. It could have been academics for another. It could have been something else like piano, whatever. That becomes your white whale. And it's not something you even have like a cathartic release when you get to that sort of, mountaintop of like winning this or getting first place that, or, scoring best in the competition on a violin recital. It is a very definition of a Pyrrhic victory, right? Because it's not for you.
Versus happiness.
Yeah. It's not for you, it's for your parents. And I totally actually understand that too. I have, because they've come to this country to sort of start anew and again, to win in things again that cannot be taken away.
Can you enjoy golf nowadays?
Absolutely not. No, I hate it. I think because I spend so much time doing it. And it doesn't mean that I wouldn't want to play, and this is the competitor drive in me, is there are times where I'm like, well, if I just started playing again, maybe I could make the senior tour. And that's just not what I want to do. And I know that I have the tendency to sort of do that. And then I'd realize, like, I don't even like playing this game. Like, what? Do I get invited to every member guest? Yes. Even though my game's terrible, it doesn't matter. People still want me to play. But and it's not just that. It's the whole thing. So I think it has a lot of memories, and I hope maybe one day I can enjoy it. But I don't foresee it in my future.
Do you think that, when I've seen you at work, like you are totally in the moment, immersed as a chef or even a consumer of food? Do you think that was some form of therapy for you, or did that just come along separately?
Well, I mean, again, pouring yourself into work seems to be not just a Korean, but Asian American identity. Again, like for Korean men, it's, if I'm not pouring myself into work, I'm pouring myself into alcohol.
Yeah.
Right? That's your therapy. And the reflective period for working that hard is drinking to forget the work. And that's the nature for Korean men, all right? Specifically Korean men in what can be seen as a relatively misogynistic culture from an American perspective. Korean men deal with a lot of trauma, a tremendous amount of trauma that gets distilled, in lack of a better phrase, of Han. And, they won't talk about it. There's no therapy. I mean, I literally don't know of any Korean guy, maybe that's older than 50 years old, that have ever seen a psychiatrist or therapist.
Yeah.
And the two solutions are work harder, drink more.
Well, and I was going to ask you, I mean, you grew up working really hard in some of the toughest kitchens, and you're Korean. Did you struggle? Like, alcohol's all over the place. I mean, you're serving it's being paired with all of your great meals. I mean, was that a struggle at all for you?
I mean, it wasn't a struggle because I was really good at it. I mean, I'm an extraordinarily talented drinker, and that's not like it used to be cool. Now I'm like, what? Why? Why did I waste so much time? I never saw it as a problem. I saw it as a release,
Hmm.
right? Anything to forget the pain and suffering that just happened during the workday. Anything to help me go to bed. And again, at some point, a lot of those things are novel and fun, but I mean, I never saw it as suffering. I just saw it as a way to like kill time to get to the next day.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about, I'm really curious. You had said, you grew up, I didn't know this, you grew up eating a lot of Japanese food and Korean food. When you were growing up, I mean, did you like Korean food growing up?
I love Korean food, but I stopped eating kimchi and a lot of I even remember stopped eating like kalbijin, which is like one of the best Korean culinary inventions of all time, because of how friends would react to it,
Mm.
right? Kalbijin to a white kid in the suburbs probably looks disgusting, right? Um, Kimchi, for sure, as anyone that's watching this conversation can attest, is probably brought up a lot of painful memories. So no, I didn't have wonderful feelings with Korean food. And I remember because my brother stopped eating kimchi, I stopped eating kimchi. And I remember being like, well, grandpa doesn't eat kimchi. So that was like a rational excuse. But I think, I can't remember when, there was certainly a period where I definitely didn't want anything to do with Korean food. But Japanese food seemed to be okay to me.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, you spent a lot of time in Japan. You've written about how Momofuku kind of changed your life. Was there a time when eating Korean food felt better than not? Like, was there a transition, or have you just always, has it always been there for you from a culinary standpoint?
Well, from a culinary standpoint, you know, so many people, including myself, run away from the childhood that they, you know, grew up in. And I was ashamed, or I don't know if ashamed is the right word, but it wasn't something I thought ever wanted to celebrate. And it's natural for me to diminish any love I had for Korean food when you look at the world at large in 1999, 2000, when I started cooking professionally, because no one cared about it. No one cared about Asian food in general, maybe Japanese food, but it's hard to have sort of hindsight and be like, well, that's crazy, because you have 20 plus years of food culture becoming more popular. People are more aware than ever before. But back then, the only thing that was considered acceptable was Western food, particularly French food. Even then, people didn't care about Italian food like they do today. Like, it just wasn't considered a cuisine that could be taken seriously. So if that was with Italian food, and where it is today with popularity, imagine what Korean food was. It was at the lowest levels, because a lot of people were like, it can't be a 4-star restaurant, can't be a 3 Michelin star restaurant. And if it was more Frenchified than Italian, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to learn everything that was not Korean. And it wasn't just me. I think it was a lot of people. I look at a lot of my Korean American chef peer group, and they all felt the same way. I don't think a single one of us, and again, I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, but we're like, yes, I want to express myself through Korean food. And I'd argue the difference between Korean American chefs versus, say, other chefs of Asian cultures is there is a generation with Roy Choi, Corey Lee, there's a few, they've had the ability to sort of pick and choose whatever they wanted to incorporate into how they express themselves through food. And I think partly is because no one ever cared about Korean food.
Do you feel that when you reach a certain level of the culinary game, when you're David Chang or Corey Lee, that it gives you the right or ability to reintroduce?
No, I don't think it was. I don't think it has anything to do with the stature. I think it has to. I genuinely think it has more to do with cultural context. I see a generation of Chinese American chefs that are super talented, but they still have to attach themselves to tradition. Japanese chefs still have to attach themselves to tradition because historically they have a much more robust, successful history than Korean culture. And for whatever reason, again, I'm not an anthropologist, sociologist. We should talk to Dr. Jim Kim about this, but I think there's something about what happened with the Korean War and Korean culture, historically speaking, and it happening in America, where it gave Korean American chefs the freedom to be like, I'm not beholden to anything. No one can tell me what Korean culture is or isn't. I can do whatever I want. And it's a very nuanced thing, but I do believe it's one of the reasons why the past 20 years has seen, Korean food sort of burst out and bust out into new realms and possibilities than anyone could. It was just right place, right time.
Yeah, no, that this is great. Dave, we've seen you a long time ago in like freshly pressed white kitchen uniforms to like you opened up Momofuku and you made it much more accessible to have awesome food, and now often we see you cooking at home, hacking food, using the microwave, teaching home chefs throughout COVID how to make kick-ass meals. What do you think's next for you from a culinary standpoint?
Well, what's next is, I think, I'm figuring that out. I think I stepped down as CEO. I don't think I technically was CEO. I mean, I never called myself CEO, but I think technically I was CEO. And 2.5 years ago, Marguerite Mariscal became CEO. I've been working on this transition for a while, mainly because I don't know why people assume chefs would be good managers of business. And I think I did a good enough job, but as a founder / CEO, someone like you, Dave, who's worked with plenty, I for one know that I'm not best suited to grow a growing business into all the complexities that it can be. So I wanted to do something else, and I wanted to focus my efforts on media and align the platforms that have become available to me, whether it's TV or podcasts, and do so the same things I try to do with Momofuku in media. And I've always felt that restaurants are content creators. So I don't think the patterns of how I think about it are drastically different. But, the days of me putting on whites and working the way I used to are done. I don't have decision-making rights anymore. I really don't. It's
You don't want them.
I never wanted them, but I like officially don't have any. And people always say like, you can do this. I was like, no, actually I don't. I've given them up. I've given them away because it's going to better serve the company. I'm still highly involved, but I don't have the decision-making rights. I don't have authority.
Well, some could say it almost looks prescient, right? Dave, with COVID, with what everyone's going through, which is tragic. How do you see that old life you left changing through this pandemic? Is it permanently altered? Like, what do you think the future of restaurants and food might be here?
No one would ever call me an optimistic person, but again, I joke that I am because I'm a pessimist that hopes to be wrong. I want to make sure that I know what the floor is and what's around the corner and be prepared for all scenarios. The industry at large was headed, it was a bubble to begin. Again, 5 years ago, we had charted out where we wanted to take the company, and it wasn't going to be within the four walls of a restaurant. And we've tried a lot of different things, from publishing to equipment manufacturing, the whole nine, because in delivery, right? I think we're the first company to start 2 delivery platforms because I knew that was going to be something. We were wrong on the timing, but all the data suggested that restaurants and restaurant culture as we knew it were headed for some kind of crucible. And I didn't know it was going to be COVID, but I thought it was going to be something else. But regardless, the industry was going to have to change. And I thought that that change was going to be technology, that change was going to be consumer eating habits, real estate prices, fixed costs in general were getting out of control, labor, all these things were like, okay, um, you know, it's not going to work moving forward. And whatever those changes were going to be, I think in 2035, if you sort of extrapolated all the change that happened in 6 months, that would have happened in 15 plus years, except that nobody would have noticed the difference. It's like that sort of, high school experiment where you put a frog into cold water and you slowly ratchet up the temperature and doesn't even know that it boiled to death. And that's sort of what would have happened with the restaurant industry, except that now all that change for the most part happened in the past 7.5 months. And it's exposed the fragile nature foundation of the business of independent restaurants. And unfortunately, I think that it's going to forever change it. We could talk about this forever, and I have, and I've been trying to make sure that we get aid in a variety of ways from legislation. But I said before the pandemic sort of really got into focus, I thought it would be a 90% closure rate. And I don't think that number's changed. And even if there's a vaccine and all these things happen, if you just think about the business corporate expenditures that are not going to come to restaurants, that's going to shut down so many, even if everything comes back online. So I'm actually hopeful, though. I think that we needed to get a kick in the ass. I think there was too much of celebrating or ensuring the status quo would remain. And I am hopeful that we can use this opportunity to rebuild a stronger foundation, because it would be foolish for us not to think that another pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster or, God forbid, another virus, will shake our industry to its core. So let's use this opportunity, much honestly, like what Korea did when MERS happened, right? They're like, wow, this is scary. And I think only like 53 people passed, but we can see. So let's overhaul everything in the event that this happens again. And I think it's not just the restaurant industry, it's America at large that has this opportunity to sort of reformulate, reshape how we look about, our business and culture moving forward, not just the restaurant industry.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You personally, reshaped and changed yourself from being that great chef to frankly being a part of media, a part of everyday pop culture. And it gives you a platform as a Korean American leader that I don't think a lot of other Korean Americans have at all. If as we close this conversation, to put you on the spot, if you could offer a single challenge, that would really push a lot of your Korean American peers and leaders to do what you've done, to be a bit more of a pioneer and trailblazer than to do well enough. What would you do? What would you say is a provocative challenge for those of us who want to make as much change as you have?
I mean, I always say that if you want to make a change for yourself and your culture and your community, particularly as a Korean American, I mean, and I don't say take this with a grain of salt, but it's much more nuanced than what I'm about to say. You almost have to destroy it. People are afraid of change. And it's clear that whatever's successful for Korean American communities barely works. So why continue to do it? And as we've established a larger presence in America, we can, again, maybe potentially extrapolate what I was just talking about with Korean chefs. We've become maybe a little bit too stale in how we should move things, in terms of how we should challenge ourselves and our own communities. And now we're trying to protect the lead instead of increase the lead. And I have enough conversations with Asian Americans and particularly Korean Americans that are afraid of challenging the status quo, afraid of challenging their parents, their church congregations, or whatever. And my response that I don't always share, but I'll share with you guys, is your parents didn't immigrate to this country so you could follow the same rules, to do the same things that they did. They came to this country so you could challenge it. You could say, I disagree with it. Like, what are you trying to protect? So again, it actually always like makes me completely bewildered as to why we don't challenge all these assumptions, and to go out there and to actually maybe not be Korean American is the best way to rephrase or redefine what it is to be Korean American, and to realize, I think most importantly, that just like there's no monolith of Asian culture, there should be none of the same for Korean American culture. That we need to be as diverse as possible to destroy the stereotypes of the model minority, what it is to be Korean American, to show that not every Korean American is afflicted by Han or has rage issues or whatever. I think that it's an opportunity for anyone that's Korean American to find exactly what they want to do or be on their terms. And that's the best way, I think, to move Korean American culture and understanding forward, is by literally destroying it. And you cannot create new. And I think it's keeping one foot in the past, but you need to have one foot moving forward. And by moving forward, you're going to sometimes destroy and eradicate the past, and you have to be comfortable with that.
That's a powerful message. That's great. Dave, thanks for your time. I look forward to seeing you in person one day. But in the meantime, take care.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, guys.